Today is June 8th. My name is Jill Chadwick with the University of Kansas Hospital, and I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Grantham for the Society's Living History Project. Dr. Grantham has been a member of the American Physiological Society and affiliated with the University of Kansas since 1969. Dr. Grantham's research has focused on transport in isolated segments of renal tubules, as well as transport characteristics of renal cysts in patients with autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, or ADPKD. Dr. Grantham, welcome to the Living History Project, and we thank you for agreeing to be interviewed.
Pleased to be here.
Let's start with learning a little bit about you and your family. Tell us about your upbringing.
Well, I was born in Dodge City, Kansas, about 80 years ago, and lived in western Kansas most of the years I was in elementary school and high school. I think of Johnson, Kansas as the town I grew up in, which is way out in far western Kansas, 16 miles from Colorado. The flattest place in the earth is in Johnson, Kansas. You can see for 30 miles in any direction, and not a hill in sight. So I was fortunate to grow up in a family with two parents. They both took really good care of me. I was an only child for 14 years, and an only child and a spoiled brat for 14 years. And at the age of 14, I got a nice little sister, Annie, who came along and took away some of my priority, I suppose you would say. And unfortunately, at the same time that she came along, I contracted something called poliomyelitis. And it sort of took away my dreams of being a pitcher for the New York Yankees or a quarterback for the Kansas University Jayhawks. I had to turn my attention to more cerebral things than athletic things. And to some extent, that was probably a good thing that happened.
Well, I think for a lot of patients that have benefited from your research and what you do, I bet they would agree. But still, contracting polio at such a young age, that must have been difficult.
It was life-changing. I call it one of my great shaping experiences, because it really knocked me out. I couldn't use either arm. One of my legs was gone, and took away one of my lung functions by paralyzing the diaphragm. And so it meant that I had to overcome these difficulties. At the same time, my best friend, Donnie Richard, had been admitted to the hospital where I was in Wichita with polio as well, but he never got to come home. He ended up dying in an iron lung. And that sort of took my heart away because, as I pointed out, he was my best friend. And I made it out, and he didn't. So you have some of that survivor's remorse sort of thing from time to time. But I made a pledge to Donnie. I made a pledge to him, said, you know, while he was still alive, I'm going to do my best to live for both of us. So that's sort of been my credo, I guess, all of my life, and that is to live for two, not just one.
And your medical journey at that point, did that inspire you then toward?
Absolutely, absolutely. It started with my family physician who made the diagnosis. He came out to our house the day that I fell terribly ill, performed a spinal tap right there in my bedroom, made the diagnosis of polio, and then sent me to the hospital in Wichita for care and rehabilitation. When I came back home, he took me under his wing. He knew that I had a decent brain to work with, so he hired me as his janitor for his office. So I'd go in and clean his office every day, and he'd find his way down there to talk to me from time to time. Occasionally would show me things under the microscope, like a urine from an infected bladder or kidney, and all that pus in the urine and bacteria swimming around. It was pretty exciting to see that. And on one occasion, he went out and caught a grasshopper and took the testes out of the grasshopper and made a smash preparation. I could see the sperm in the grasshopper testes, swimming around. Wow, I was smitten by science. And I was smitten by his caring. and the kind of a man he was. And I said to myself, well, that's what I'd like to be.
So whose idea was it to go to Baker University?
Well, that was an accident, actually. I was enrolled at KU, had a scholarship. My parents didn't have enough money to rub two nickels together, so I'd gotten scholarship, and the Kansas Crippled Children's Organization was going to help with other fees, and KU was relatively cheap. I had worked for a man at a filling station who was of considerable wealth. His name was Fred Collingwood, and he got to know me pretty well, and he didn't think KU was the right place for me. So I was notified by my high school principal one day that said, Jared, you've got a full scholarship to Baker. So I do. I didn't even know what Baker was and where it was. He said, well, it's a Methodist school in eastern Kansas. And it turns out the man my benefactor, one of his daughters was a student there, and he had had another daughter go to that school, so he thought it'd be a good match for me. A small school, small town boy, I wouldn't get lost in a big school. So that's how I ended up at Baker, and it was a perfect match. It was a perfect match. They took me in. I was a little bit different. I walked with a limp. I had an arm that looked a little different. My posture was different. Didn't make any difference to those kids. And that's where I met and fell in love with my wife.
Well, you eventually made it to KU, though, into med school. Tell us about that.
Well, I decided I wanted to go to medical school at KU. It's the only school I enrolled in, that I applied to, and they took me. I think I was kind of in the middle of the class of students they took that year. So I was admitted to KU Medical Center. And the first year we went to medical school on the top of the Mount Oriat, which is where the undergraduate campus is located. And so Carol and I had an apartment at the top of Mount Oriat, and I got to walk across the crest of the hill every morning to class, listening to the carillons sound, the bell tower making noises and sounds and wonderful music. It was an idyllic experience. Our first year of married life, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. The next 3 years, we moved to Kansas City, and I took classes here on this campus at KU Medical Center.
And you still had a research bug. It sounds like that your polio doctor, your family physician, sort of ignited that.
Yes.
But now you're at KU Med School, and you're very interested in research.
Well, we were moving over here from Lawrence, and I didn't have a job that summer between my freshman and sophomore year. So I'd heard they had research positions open in the basic science areas. So I went over and started walking through the basic science building, knocking on doors. And I finally found one. It was a surgeon. He wasn't a basic scientist, but he was a surgeon, Dr. Paul Slurb. And he had one of the early issues of the Kolff twin coil artificial kidney that he was using to do research on. He was doing research in dogs, and he was taking care of patients who had acute kidney failure. Well, anyway, he signed me on, and I just had a fantastic experience that first year. Developed enough information that I wrote a paper that was published in the American Journal of Physiology, the organization, by the way, that's sponsoring this history lesson. And so in my junior and senior year, I was addressed as Dr. Grantham, even though I didn't have a MD or a PhD degree, because of I was getting correspondence, from the journal and various authors asking for reprints. So that turned out to be the most seductive year of my life, because it branded me as a researcher forever.
And that's how you got led to the National Institutes of Health to work with Robert Berliner?
Well, the other part of that story is Dr. Berliner was director of the Art Institute intramural program at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. And he had visited the campus giving lectures on the kidney. And I heard one of his lectures and was enthralled by what he was talking about, the renal excretion of potassium. And anyway, I thought, well, boy, that would be a good place to go do research. Well, as it turns out, Dr. Slurb and another advisor I had, Dr. George Curran, both knew Dr. Berliner and Dr. Orloff, who was in that same NIH division. And so they contacted Orloff and Berliner on my behalf, and I wrote a letter asking to be accepted. Well, they didn't have any positions that year, but they said, if you're interested, write to us again. So I did. I kept hounding them until they finally took me on.
You seem to have a theme in your life. I went door to door and I knocked.
Yes.
They said right back. I wrote again. So persistence is important.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you have a dream, you have to pursue it. You can't stop short of pursuing it.
As we go through your story, it also occurs to me, I'm a non-clinician, but every time I talk with the doctor, and I'm always wondering, how did you decide on kidneys that excite you? And it sounds like it is similar with other doctors in that it's usually relationships with people that were already in that field. You get connected to the people as much as you're interested in that particular part of the body.
Jill, I'm not a religious man, but I think there was a providential factor that was involved in some of this. As the story goes on, some of my heroes, who were kidney people, were connected through their names, like Homer Smith. Donnie Richards' father's name was Homer. My first book I ever wrote was Homer, a Poor Man's Dog, when I was about in the 6th grade, I guess you might say. And so there's a connection there that keeps coming up over and over again. And then just wandering into Dr. Paul Schlerb's lab, and then ultimately connecting with the NIH lab in the kidney area, brought me back to Homer Smith and kidney disease and kidney physiology. Homer Smith is one of the heroes, one of the giants of renal physiology. He was not a physician, but he was a world-class physiologist who interacted with physicians and helped them take basic science knowledge to the bedside and use it to treat patients.
That's interesting.
So there's a connection there. And the theme of kidneys, of course, I really ran into kidneys with Paul Schlerb and the artificial kidney. And then that segued into Robert Berliner, Jack Orloff, and ultimately Maurice Berg, Moberg we called him, who the fellow that I ultimately really worked with when I went to the NIH.
And now you were at the NIH for 5 years?
Well, I went there as a fellow, first of all. I had a fellowship for 2 years. And actually I lived in Dr. Orloff's house, my mentor, who went on a sabbatical leave the year I went. He had a dream of actually taking the kidney apart. The kidneys are really hideously complicated. They've got lots of little spaghetti-like tubules in them. They've got little filters, blood vessels, and they just go every which way. And it's a difficult organ to study because it's buried in the back. It doesn't make any sounds. You can't listen to it. And all you can do is measure what goes in and what comes out. Well, Berg wanted to take the kidney apart and study the individual pieces. To do that, we had to actually take a kidney and dissect it under a microscope and pull out these little hair-sized tubules and study them under a microscope. And in order to do that, we had to fashion pipettes, little tiny micropipettes that we could plug into one end of a tubule and collect the fluid when it came out the other end. That took us about a year. And I had an instrumental role in making that work. It was his idea and his dream. But I was the guy that first decided to try to dissect the kidney without any enzyme treatments. And that's when we found that we could actually get the tubules out without any treatment and study them in vitro. And then I invented the pipette for collecting the fluid at the other end. And with that, we took off and started studying individual kidney tubules. And it revolutionized renal physiology at that time.
And so when you were doing that, were you still at the NIH or had you come back to KU Med?
I was still at the NIH. I was there in the first and the second year at the NIH. And I was making plans to either come back to KU or go somewhere else, to get a full-time job.
Right.
And when the NIH got wind of that, they came up with a counteroffer and asked me to stay on the permanent staff. So I got a big boost in salary and a position as a staff investigator, and I stayed there again for another 3 years. And we did some seminal work on the movement of water through biological membranes under the influence of a hormone called vasopressin. And that has stayed with me through my whole career, even to the time that I worked with polycystic kidney disease. That theme has stayed in place through all that time.
But you finally found your way back home.
Found our way back home in 1969. Dr. Darrell Phanestill, who was the new director of nephrology at KU, asked me to come back and join his faculty. Carol was ready to come home. She was a small town girl. She wanted to be back in the Midwest. I was willing to come back if I had the right opportunity, and I did. So I came back and set up my own laboratory. And shortly after that, Dr. Phanestill decided he's going to go to greener pastures himself. So he went off to La Jolla, California, to the new medical school out there, asked me to go along. I said, no, I can't move my family twice in such a short period of time. So we stayed at KU.
You became division director.
And I became the division director, and I wasn't even dry behind the ears, you know, and had not been in clinical medicine for 5 years. So I had a lot of catching up to do.
Did you have any advice for others that are in that similar kind of position on being suddenly thrust into leadership?
Yes, well, but I was fortunate because there were two people here who were just fantastic physician scientists in their own rights. Dr. Dennis Diederich, who's still on the faculty here, and Dr. Donald Tucker, who unfortunately has passed away. And they were the core in nephrology to begin with. And then later on, a few years later, we hired Dr. Arnold Shanko from Ohio State University and Dr. Virginia Savin, who came down from University of Washington. They kind of rounded up the five of us who ran the nephrology division for the next 10 or 15 years. They were a wonderful team to work with. Everybody shared the work. Everyone was a physician scientist. They were all in their laboratories doing scientific investigation. At the same time, they were taking care of patients. So that's unheard of today almost. Mm-hmm. But that was the norm then for really good medical schools.
Well, and you continued to rise through the ranks. You became the first director of the Kidney Institute.
Well, that came many, many years later. There were several iterations of the Kidney Institute. The Kidney Urology Research Center, we tried to do that. We couldn't get the funding for it. And we tried it a couple of times, couldn't get the funding for it. And finally, in 2000, the administration came to me, says, you know, we want to remodel the 2 floors on the research building over there, and why don't you write a grant to the NIH to do that? And I said, well, I'll do that if you'll give me the Kidney Institute and some money to run it.
There you go.
They agreed to do that. And at that time, we had some really strong kidney researchers on this campus. Dr. Dale Abrahamson, who is still here in the anatomy cell biology department. Dr. Billy Hudson, who was chairman of the Department of Biochemistry, was here. And Dr. Tom DeBose, who was chairman of the Department of Medicine, was here. And Dr. Jim Calvette, who's a professor of biochemistry. We got together and formed the Kidney Institute, which is still going today, 16 years later. And pleased to say that 2 of those founders received the Homer Smith Award from the American Heart Association and the American Society of Nephrology. And we've also had awards to individuals in other parts, in other societies and other organizations that were substantial.
And just like when you had polio,
Yes.
your relationships with friends and mentors shaped your interest. You had a childhood friend that suffered from polycystic
Yes,
disease,
that's correct.
and And you remembered that.
Well, I have to go back a little bit on this because when I first moved to Johnson, Kansas, my next door neighbor was named Ronnie Wilkerson, and he and I used to play together, and we would trade comic books, you know, usually in the kitchen, under our mother's skirts, you know, while they're trying to fix dinner or something. And he was a good trader. I mean, he was a hard guy to trade with because he'd always want to trade me one Superman for two of my lesser-known titles. But anyway, we had fun trading comic books. And one day, I was in the 6th grade, he said, "You know, Jared, I've got cysts on my kidneys. My mom's got them, and my grandmother had them. Well, what am I supposed to say when somebody tells you they have cysts in their kidneys?" I didn't know what cysts were. I probably said, "Well, that's interesting. How about your Archie? I'll take it." So anyway, it wasn't until actually we got together again when we were in high school after a football practice. And he played center on the football team, and I was a guard. So we had a pretty hard practice that year, and that day. And as young men do, we went into the locker room to relieve ourselves, and there was this latrine. He was standing over to my right, and I can remember looking down the latrine. I saw this blood coming down the latrine, and what the heck is going on? And I looked over there, it was Ronnie, he was passing blood. And what's going on? "Oh, it's just one of those cysts ruptured. Do it all the time. I'll drink some water tonight, go away. Don't worry about it, Jared, don't worry about it." Well, I did. I mean, that stuck in my memory and never will leave. And it was years later, after we'd come back to Kansas, and I'd set up my own laboratory, that I made what I consider my seminal discovery in physiology, and that is that tubules could secrete fluid as well as reabsorb it. Renal physiologists will understand what I'm talking about here. Prior to that, it was thought that the kidney filtered plasma and reabsorbed everything it didn't want and got rid of the rest. What I found was that the kidney could actually secrete fluid as well as reabsorb it. And it dawned on me that maybe that's how that fluid gets into those cysts in Ronnie's kidneys. And I thought more about it and started doing some research on it, and everything kept pointing in that direction. So I spent the next 30 years of my life trying to figure out what causes cysts to form and what we can do to slow them down. And that started because of that image of Ronnie Wilkerson popped into my head when I was being puzzled by discovering this bizarre mechanism that nobody had ever thought too much about before. And so again, that's providential perhaps. I don't know. But I was alert enough, as Pasteur would say, chance favors the prepared mind. I was alert enough and aware enough to take advantage of that unusual finding to take it into another level.
So your research resulted in the founding of the Polycystic Kidney Research Foundation.
Yes.
Another proud moment, I'm sure.
There's a story there as well.
You have great stories, by the way.
Polycystic kidney disease is not something very many people have heard about. And your struggle to even say autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease is a good example of that. It's a mouthful. And nobody wants to try to remember that sort of thing. So PKD is sort of an unknown disease, except there's probably 500,000-600,000 people in this country who have it. And once I got into research of polycystic kidney disease, I started thinking about the clinical manifestations and how to treat it. And it turns out there was very, very little known about it. NIH wasn't supporting any research in the area. And here I had all these new ideas and leads that I wanted to pursue. And I was sitting in my lab one day, sort of feeling sorry for myself, and someone knocked on my door. It was a reporter from the Kansas City Star. She had been sent to my laboratory to see if she could find something interesting to write about.
Interesting.
So she sat down, and I poured out my heart to her. I mean, this is a Rodney Dangerfield disease. You know, nobody don't get no respect, you know. And she listened for 2 hours and wrote everything down. And she said, "I'm going to write you a good story." So she left, kept looking for the story to show up in the Star. Nothing showed up. Nothing. Weeks went by, and finally I heard she left the Star. I said, "She left the Star? I guess that article got her fired." I mean, and time went on, and finally, in February of 1981, on the 22nd page of the A section of the Sunday Star, there was this across the page article about this unusual disease this guy at KU was studying. Well, Joseph Bruning, who lived just down state line on 65th Street thereabouts, saw the article. His wife had PKD. He had a little cash in his pocket, so he contacted me about doing something to improve research in polycystic kidney disease. And I said, "Well, let's get together." So we did, and out of that we developed the Polycystic Kidney Research Foundation initially, to keep the focus on research. And he got busy trying to find more wealthy people to kind of put some money in the pot. Mm-hmm. He found them. We found an executive director, and the organization then began to take off.
And all this while, you're doing this research, you're dealing with your foundation, and you're still a practicing nephrologist.
I'm practicing. I'm doing all of these things, and neglecting my family, by the way, while I was doing it. I mean, I was working about 20 hours a week just trying to keep my head above water. But my wife understood. Carol has been a marvelous partner through all of this. She understood where this was going and what the payoffs eventually would be. And so she stuck by me, and she managed the kids, did a marvelous job with them, managed the home. And she's my confidant. I go to her with all my questions and concerns about God knows what to get those resolved. She's a wise woman. Anyway, the foundation took off and is now the world's leading proponent of polycystic kidney disease. It's got startup foundations in most of the major countries of the world now, and we've got chapters scattered throughout the United States. I think
what a legacy.
Yeah, they've raised over almost $40 million in research by themselves. Not only that, but they had an effective voice with NIH and Congress to get more funding for polycystic kidney disease research. So the portfolio of grants at the NIH is more like $30 to $40 million a year for PKD research.
To kind of put it in perspective.
Yes.
All right. So we've only got a few more questions we want to ask. One of them is, what do you think is your most significant contribution to physiology and nephrology?
Well, my most significant contribution to physiology is twofold. One, I was the first to absolutely prove that the collecting duct of the mammalian kidney was a site of vasopressin action to increase the permeability to water of that barrier. And that's really important because it has to do with your ability to concentrate your urine and not have to have access to water all the time. So I think that was a seminal contribution, but also came along with developing this technique that allowed us to open this black box called a kidney and to help other people adapt that same strategy to begin to put names and faces on all the parts of the kidney and actually identify the individual functions of the kidney tubule segments. Mm-hmm. And to the extent now that the kidney is not nearly the mystery that it used to be. The second contribution to physiology was my discovery that the kidney tubules could actually secrete liquid as well as reabsorb it. So in the area of physiology, I think that is Those are my seminal contributions, I guess you would say. With respect to polycystic kidney disease research, I think seeing the connection between fluid secretion and the formation of cysts and the filling of cysts with fluid, and ultimately discovering that cyclic AMP, the second messenger of the hormone vasopressin, was very instrumental in making those cysts grow faster. And I can't take credit for this, but Vince Gattone, who was also in our Kidney Institute, made the connection between vasopressin and kidney growth, and actually was the first to demonstrate that if he could block the effect of vasopressin on polycystic kidneys, he could slow down the rate that they grew and improve the function. That has now been translated into a clinical trial that shows the same thing in human beings using a drug called tolvaptan. So we've gone full cycle, all the way from the beginning collecting duct and just saying, what's it doing for a living, to the point of saying, if we block how that hormone affects the water transport in that tubule, we can actually treat a renal disease with that.
Similar question, this time let's talk about societies. What roles have societies played in your work?
What role has society played? Well, for one thing, society has paid for it. Your taxes, which go into the NIH or the state of Kansas, have had a lot to do with making funds available for those of us in research to do what we do. Thankfully, in this country, our populace is of the mind that they appreciate medical science and medical research, and they support it enthusiastically. And that's true of our legislative bodies in Congress. Even though they can't get along for 5 minutes on some issues, they get along with respect to the importance of science. And I've got to hand them a kudo for that.
How about medical advice to young students? And I'm thinking, now that I know you've got grandkids that are sort of following your path, what kind of advice do you have to med students today?
Well, if you think you want to go into medicine, do it. Strive for it, particularly if you find it interesting and something you think would motivate you for the rest of your life. Whatever you do with your life, from the point of view of what we call work, you've got to like what you do to have a successful life, in my view. And I think that striving to find the thing you really like to do is the first piece of advice I would give. And then if you find it in science or biology or medicine, then go for it. You go in there and learn everything you can possibly learn about your craft. And if you have the gift, you may find yourself even going into research if you're able to do that. But do it with enthusiasm and stick-to-itiveness, and don't give up. Never give up.
I think our viewers are going to find this next little bit of tidbit about you sort of interesting. In reviewing your career, you like to write children's books.
I do.
Tell me about that. Did they have a science theme?
Well, the children's book that I wrote first is called Ashley and the Mooncorn People. Ashley was our first granddaughter, first grandchild. She came along at a time in our family where there was great sorrow. Our youngest son, Joel, and 3 other students at the University of Kansas, he was a sophomore at the time, were killed in a train wreck when a train hit their car as they were going through a crossing north of Lawrence. And that was, of course, devastating to us, to lose a child. And that's the first time I'd really experienced grief, profound grief. And to me, grief is wasted energy. I mean, I just can't imagine spending my time grieving. I should be doing something more constructive with that energy. And that's when I began to pay attention to our granddaughter and her play. And her father had dug up a tree stump in the backyard, And she had sat there, watched him do it all the time he was doing that. And it just popped into my head that when he got down into that stump, started digging around, he found a little mason jar that had been broken. And he wondered, well, what in the world was in that mason jar? Well, Ashley found out that night when two little people came to her windowsill. They'd been buried there for 100 years under a spell, and they had now been freed. And they visited her, and these people turned out to be the mooncorn people, because they had some seeds. As if she planted those seeds and harvested the seeds and they could eat the corn, they would get their size back and they could go back to their home country in Belgium. So that was Ashley and the Mooncorn People, and then the sequel to that book is Ashley and the Doll Maker. And Ashley meets an interesting woman on her street who makes dolls and gives them to little children who don't have dolls. And these are magic dolls because when the children kind of put them away, they outgrow them, the dolls find their way back to the doll maker and they tell her the story of where they've been. So the doll maker has all of these stories from all these little children that she gave dolls to that she can tell Ashley. And so she starts telling her these stories about the different individuals that she came in touch with through the dolls when they talked to her, when they found her way back to her house. So that's Ashley and the Doll Maker. So
you are living an amazing life. You really are. You're a very fascinating person to talk to.
Well, thank you.
From your beginning as a child to your life as an author and all that you have done for patients in between. It's just been a joy to visit with you. Do you want to have a final word?
All I can say is thank you for your kind words. I appreciate the opportunity to tell you my story.
And I have a feeling we could talk for much longer if we had more time.
I think we could.
All right, thank you, Dr. Grantham. And thank you for participating in the Society's Living History program. We truly enjoyed the opportunity to learn more about you and your career. And we also thank all of those that are watching. Thank you.